Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of conversing with Jason Vickers, professor of theology at Asbury Theological Seminary in central Kentucky, outside Lexington, specifically delightful Wilmore, known as the Holy City. And we're going to start off at least by talking about a new book just being released on Wesleyan Christology, of which Jason is the co-editor. So Jason, thank you so much for being available today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mark. And just a quick shout out here at the beginning to the other co-editor, Jerome Van Kyken. It was a pleasure to work with Jerome. And so I just want to make sure we give him credit.
Absolutely. And who are some of the other authors in this book?
Yeah, there's a nice range of authors, Paul Chilcote and Tom McCall, Mark Olson, there's John Drury, Justice Hunter, Reginald Broadnax, Christina Smerick. That's a sampling there. I'm sure I'm leaving a couple out, but that's quite a few of them.
Well, for the benefit of Methodists who don't understand what their own tradition has to say about Christology, and also for other Christians who don't know what the particular distinctives are of Wesleyan Christology, how does Wesleyan Christology differ from Lutheran Christology or Reformed Christology or Catholic Christology?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. In some ways, this book charts a bit of a journey of development in the Methodist tradition in the area of Christology. And you can think of the journey as having three phases. The early
Jason, if I could interrupt you, getting really back to basics, explain briefly, what is Christology?
It's the study of the person and work of Christ. So the relationship between Christ's natures, divine and human, as well as the nature of his work on the cross, and especially how his sacrifice saves.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, you were saying?
Yeah, so what we're really trying to show here is development in the Methodist tradition in the area of Christology. And it unfolds, the book does, in three big phases. An early phase, and you could say sort of a middle and a late, but the middle is really the late 19th and the majority of the 20th century. And then the late phase, the third and final section, has to do with proposals today, recent, fresh proposals that are happening now. Now, just quickly, what I think the book shows is that in the early going, Wesley, John and Charles Wesley, and other early Methodists were in Christology mainly committed to kind of basic orthodoxy, what you find in something like the Nicene Creed. There is, I think it needs to be said, a bit of an emphasis on the deity of Jesus in the early tradition. You will certainly find that in someone like Thomas Coke, and Mark Olson addresses that in his chapter. Now, the reason for that is that in the 18th century, things like deism, Unitarianism, Socinianism, they raised some real questions around the deity of Jesus that early Methodist theologians like the Wesleys, John Fletcher, and Coke and others were concerned to respond to, and they often kind of then emphasize the deity of Jesus, sometimes in a way that makes it seem like they are weaker on the humanity of Jesus. So that's an issue in the early tradition, but I think it's largely a contextual issue that has to do with who they perceive to be a bit of a threat, if you will, to orthodoxy in their day. But in the broad, in the main, they're really not doing too much innovative in Christology, especially in the early going. And if anything, the focus of the tradition, and I think this remains true most of the way through, is on the work of Christ rather than the person of Christ. So we tend to accentuate the atonement, Christ's atoning sacrifice, and specifically the universal scope of the atonement, that Christ dies for all, which would be a point that a lot of Wesleyans would say distinguishes us from the Reformed or Calvinist tradition, that it's the universality, the universal atonement that's a hallmark of the Wesleyan tradition in Christology, more so than any unique position on Christ's person. If anything, we tend to be a little underdeveloped on the person of Christ compared to the work of Christ. Now, just quickly, I'll kind of summarize this quickly as quickly as I can. From there, what happens is in the mid-19th century, and Tom McCall does a nice job with this, we have the emergence of what we call dogmatic theologians in the tradition, Methodist dogmatic theologians, most notably William Burke Pope in England. And what they try to do is provide for Methodists a Christological foundation that is deeply indebted to the Nicene Chalcedonian tradition. They try to flesh that out more, especially on Christ's person. The problem with it is that the intellectual culture, generally speaking, in the late 19th century shifted quickly after people like Pope put out 3-volume theologies, right, and whole volumes on Christology. And suddenly their style or way of doing theology was seen as very out of date. And so the tradition moved on from them really before it ever reckoned with their work or absorbed it. It sort of dismissed it the minute it came off the press. You can see this in especially in the way some of the Boston Personalists handled that material. They were quick to just dismiss it. And with personalism, Borden, Parker, Bound, Knudsen, and others, you quickly get into a reframing of Christology in new categories. So with the personalists, you reframe teaching about Jesus, who he is and what he does, in personalist metaphysical terms. So it's a kind of a philosophical, theological project. So we cover that, and then we move into other proposals, mid-20th century proposals around the person and work of Jesus, most notably those associated with Albert Outler and John Deschner. And there you have an emphasis on historiographical work with Outler, and really a reworking of Christology in Barthian categories in John Deschner, following Karl Barth. Okay, so then you get into the more recent proposals, feminist, Latino, Latinx, liberation type proposals, as well as some interesting chapters on where do we go after Oden, after Tom Oden. Justice Hunter writes that chapter, and where do we go after Karl Barth? And that's John Drury. And they're kind of reckoning with or grappling with the legacy of Barth and Oden respectively. And what do we take from them, and do we adopt their proposals, or do we need to go in some new direction? Now, look, the bottom line to all of that is that the story that really ends up being told is one, and this won't surprise you, of increasing pluralism in the Methodist tradition. That what you have is, whereas you have a kind of unity of teaching in the early tradition that's broadly and basically orthodox on the person and work of Christ. By the time you get to the mid-20th century, and this just continues down to the present day, the question really becomes whether any such unity exists anymore within the Methodist tradition among its theologians, or whether we've got a kind of radical pluralism on something as important as who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for us and for our salvation. So that's really, in a sense, the volume kind of puts that question on the table. Is there any unity to be discerned here among all of these 20th and now 21st century Methodist theologians.
Now, the book is published by the United Methodist Board of Higher Education, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, is a book like this a signal of an ongoing renaissance of Wesleyan theology? Would a book like this have been published, say, 30 years ago?
No, but here's an interesting reason why. Because 30 years ago, most of the focus was on Wesley. And one of the things that is new and fresh in this book, and I think signals and reflects a new direction in the way of scholarly interest overall right now, is in the Methodist or Wesleyan tradition after Wesley. So in other words, we spent 50 years, a good half century, going back to the 1960s and into the early aughts, writing a book a week on Wesley. And so we've really done Wesley a lot, and we've been better off for that, of course. But now a lot of scholars are interested in what happened. In fact, the precipitating question that gave rise to this volume was a question that Jaroslav Pelikan asked of the Methodist tradition. The eminent historian of doctrine, the Yale historian of doctrine, Jaroslav Pelikan, reviewing John Deschner's book on John Wesley's Christology, asked the question, so what happened to Christology in Methodism after Wesley? Mm-hmm. Pelikan's question that actually inspired this volume in many ways. And because we haven't grappled with that. Not only in Christology, but also other loci. We really don't have a good grasp of what happens in Wesleyan theology, Methodist theology, after Wesley. So one of the things we have discovered is that we had some really interesting, intellectually gifted theologians in the mid-19th century, like William Burt Pope. Thomas Summers would be another one. That, as I said earlier, were quickly dismissed at the time during their lifetime. Well, we're beginning to unearth their work and realize there's a lot of really good work that's done here that we have no idea about, and we're beginning to explore that. So I do think it signals a bit of a new direction on the part of scholars right now, Wesleyan scholars who are working to come to grips with what has happened theologically to Methodism after Wesley.
So it turns out Methodism is not just John Wesley, it's also a 250-year-old tradition.
Absolutely. And one of the most contentious areas of discussion that you can find is on who gets to be a part of that. When you're telling that story, so if you take someone like, and this is an ongoing argument actually between myself and Kevin Watson, and Billy Abraham for that matter, right? He gets in on this as well. Billy would insist that Borden Parker Bound and the Personalists belong to Methodism. They're a part of the tradition. We may decide that they are out to lunch on any number of things, but for Billy, they are still Methodists. I think our good friend Kevin wants to at least question that a little bit and say, well, but how far can you stray from, whatever your criteria are, theological or otherwise, and still be considered in the Methodist fold? So what this kind of looking at the history after Wesley and looking at theological doctrinal development after Wesley, what it does, it raises that question of where are the boundaries, if you will, and what are the criteria, and can we agree on that as to when someone, has left the Methodist tradition? Now, for myself, just because somebody can say, well, what would you say, right? I've always said that if nothing else, the unlimited atonement has dogmatic status in the Wesleyan tradition. So that if you show me someone that denies the unlimited atonement, that says, no, Christ did not die for everybody. He only died for a handful of folk, or however many, maybe he only died for Americans, or whomever. Well, you've now crossed a line that in my judgment, you've stepped outside the Wesleyan tradition. You're embracing a teaching that is so deeply opposed to a central tenet of Methodism, that it's really incoherent to call yourself a Methodist at that point.
Would you yourself call the Boston Personalist Methodist?
Yeah, I really do think they are. I mean, I read them as exploring an option in philosophical theology that they are drawn to, especially Baum. He's drawn to the option that he goes for in Germany, where he studies, because he inherits from his Methodist clergy, father, and he grows up in a good Methodist home, a good pious home. This emphasis on the importance of experience. And so the appeal to experience that he'll run into, though in a very different concept of experience, to be sure, but I think it resonates with him intellectually, because there had been an emphasis on experience and of a personal sort, from day one in his upbringing. So you can at least see why he goes down the road that he goes down. Now he'll end up in arguably a different place for having gone that way. But there is a sense in which it makes sense. Now what you could say here is, are Methodists free to explore contemporary proposals in something like metaphysics? Because really that's what the personalists are doing. They're taking the raw ingredients of the faith, if you will, and seeing if they can fit them into a new metaphysical framework. Now, the process theologians down the line, excuse me, will do much the same thing. They will take the process metaphysics of Whitehead and later Hartshorne and see if they can shoehorn the faith, as it were, or at least kind of reconceive of it in those terms. Now, so the question that both the personalist and the process tradition raise would be this: is there a, if you will, required metaphysics to be a Methodist? Do you have to embrace, say, a Platonist metaphysic, for example, or some other metaphysic? Is there a standard of doctrine, if you will, on metaphysics? Or are Methodists free to explore various proposals in metaphysics, right? That's to me is an open question. That's the fact that we have standards of doctrine that on, say, the Trinity or the person of Christ and any number of other doctrines, just on the books, so to speak, on the face of it, on what's there, there's no wedding of the tradition to a particular set of metaphysical proposals.
This book is written for Methodists, or is this book written for Christians of all sorts who are interested in a Wesleyan perspective?
Realistically, I think the most interested audience will be Methodists who care about the development of the tradition. But hopefully there will be theologians and historians outside Methodism who see this volume as giving insight into where we've been as a tradition on the person and work of Christ.
And pivoting off this book, where is Methodist theology today? A good place, a bad place, or somewhere in between? And how does it relate overall to, say, American evangelical theology today, comparatively?
Yeah, wow, those are huge questions, as you know. I think that Wesleyan or Methodist theology right now is trying to figure out where to go after a half century of work on Wesley. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not disparaging that work at all. We needed to come to grips with Wesley. There is a sense, though, in which we now are the beneficiary of all that work. We have, extraordinary materials ready to hand, primary resources in the bicentennial edition of the Wesley Works Project, as well as multiple volumes exploring Wesley's theology as a whole and various aspects of his theology. So we really are blessed in that regard. But now I think it's a real question of where do we go from there? You can only write so many books about John Wesley's theology. So one of the options is this kind of traditioning approach, which this volume that we were talking about represents. But then there's a question about whether or not to pick up the work of something like dogmatic theology that Pope and others were doing in the 19th century, anew and afresh in the 21st. So that's not to say that you're going to do work on William Burke Pope, but rather perhaps Wesleyans should try their hand at dogmatic theology again, or systematic theology. We've really under-delivered, Mark, in that area. I say that as a theologian, so I can I can get in line first and say that I'm as responsible as anyone for the under-delivery, but we've not exactly done a good job in the way of producing substantive, significant works in dogmatic and systematic theology. Now, I think lots of people would agree with that, but the question is, who's going to step up and do something about that? Who's going to try their hand at it? It's an intimidating task. It's when you don't just sit down on a random Tuesday and say, I'm going to write a dogmatics today. It's usually thought of as kind of a lifelong work. Recent significant works in the Lutheran and Anglican traditions in theology, but Robert Jensen's Systematics, it comes out toward the end of his career after a lifetime's work. More recently, Catherine Sonderegger's Systematics has just come out, and she's near the end of a long career. So it's really, these are works of mature reflection that take time. And hopefully we will have people in the Wesleyan tradition who will produce works like that. The other big emphases or areas of to consider would be ongoing, and this is one I think near and dear to your heart, Wesleyan political theology. Will Wesleyans do serious work in political theology? I think that Theodore Weber's work on John Wesley's political theology was absolutely first rate. I think it's one of the most underrated books ever written about Wesley. It's deserving of a much wider reading than it's ever gotten. It was certainly influential for me. But since then, we haven't exactly done a lot of work in political theology. So, it's an open question as to whether, we want to claim someone like Hauerwas as a Methodist. I mean, he himself was always nervous about identifying with Methodism. So he would routinely call himself an Anglo-Catholic or those sorts of things. But we've got others, someone like Robin Lovin or Steve Long, that are doing work in moral theology, but I don't know that they've produced mature works in political theology. So that's another area for development in the tradition that's needed right now. Really, Mark, what we need, and then I'll try to get to your evangelical question, what we really need in Methodist and Wesleyan circles is we just need a lot of fresh and innovative work being done, and we need to create space and room for that work by supporting younger scholars who are beginning to work their way up through the ranks, and giving them the support as well as the freedom they need to undertake that work. It's actually a lot of work to be done. Our tradition, as I said before, in more than one area is underdeveloped. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, which will tie me into the evangelical piece. I do think that for years, Billy Abraham has been known as a critic of the quadrilateral and being obsessed with issues in epistemology and authority and theology. And I think those are long-running features of evangelical theology more broadly, with their worries about Scripture and authority of Scripture. They tend to be worried, and there's a long history there that goes back to things like the fundamentalist modernist controversy, for example, in the early 20th century. Now, where I want to go with this is to say that In the United Methodist wing of the Wesleyan tradition, we are staring down the barrel of a church split, as you know. And the one of the temptations that I think is there is to say that we're going to double down on something like scriptural authority, maybe in the form of even something like inerrancy, because what we want to do is make sure that the issues that are dividing us can never crop up again. We want to put an end to this once and for all. And so where the focus is going to be is on matters of authority, not just theological authority in the traditional sense, say, of biblical authority, but also who's going to make a call. You have to have living interpreters, whether that's bishops or a judicial council or whatever. Someone has to be in a position to say whether or not someone has violated something, right? So we're going to worry a lot about that. And I think we're going to be so focused, the worry I have is we'll be so focused on those issues that we won't take the time, because there is an opportunity here to take the time to do some very important work in terms of our doctrinal standards, catechesis, catechetical materials. We really need to be patient here and not just resort to a kind of pragmatism that says, look, we've got to have everything done here in the next 18 months because we've got to launch a new church. I think that's a recipe for disaster. So that would be my, so the where I think they're similar now, Methodism and evangelicalism is historically is in that area of a focus on epistemological issues of authority and theology, as opposed to matters of primary doctrine, the doctrine of the Trinity, the person of Christ, and so forth. So I think our energy has been in that area of methodology and epistemology, and I think we need to grow and mature beyond that. That's one piece. The other is that particularly for the conservative wing of Methodism, of the Wesleyan tradition, that we don't neglect theology because we're caught up in, for lack of a better term, the culture wars. And I think that's where, you can raise some questions about evangelicalism today, is there's a deep investment in the culture wars, so that it's not that these are not legitimate concerns, but that you're more worried about SCOTUS and that kind of thing, and getting the right people in place so that someday you can overturn Roe v. Wade than you are the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, it could be that these things have something to do with one another. And again, this is not to say that the first worry is not legitimate. But I do think what I see in a lot of evangelicalism and conservative Methodism is overinvestment in kind of major cultural issues that are important, but an ongoing underinvestment in theology and doctrine, which has been a besetting sin of the tradition for a very long time.
Jason Vickers, professor of theology at Asbury Seminary, thank you for a fascinating conversation on Wesleyan Christology. We all look forward to reading your book.
Thank you, Mark.